I always thought it was one of life's wonderful coincidences that my fiancée was named Noel, and she loved Christmas more than anyone I know. Every single year, as soon as Halloween was over, she'd be up in the attic fetching lights, baubles and tinsel, ready to transform our home into a space so festive it would put Santa's grotto to shame. I can picture her now, hanging bows and ribbons over the fireplace in our cottage, blonde hair tied back, stray specks of glitter on her cheeks, and with the sleeves of her latest awfully cheesy Christmas jumper rolled up so she could work even harder. I even joked that the first dance at our wedding would be to the strains of I'll Be Home for Christmas, and Noel laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. She used to laugh a lot. That changed this year, in what was to be our last Christmas as an unmarried couple. The cottage had been decorated since the second week of November. We live on a small rural road, and there are only 3 other houses around us. As such, we didn't have much competition when it came to Christmas decorations, and we were always the first to switch on the lights on the front of our house. I'd spent a long time hanging strand after strand, bulb after bulb, and soon the front of our house was almost entirely covered in twinkling, sparkling lights. It was a time-consuming, fiddly job, and the electricity bill was going to skyrocket, but it was worth it. Just to see the childlike joy on Noel's face when they were first switched on. I know it sounds corny, but Christmas with Noel really was the most magical time of the year. And if she was excited at the switching on of the lights, she was practically jumping for joy when, 2 weeks ago, the heavens opened and a sudden flurry of snow drifted down onto our little lane. "Come look," she squealed, both hands pressed against the window, her nose a mere inch from the glass, as she beamed at the winter wonderland taking shape before her eyes. I slipped up behind her, wrapped my arms around her waist, and kissed her rosy cheek as we watched the snow fall together. Soon, everything was blanketed in crisp, pristine snow. I lit the log fire, mulled some wine, and we had a truly heavenly evening together. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can take comfort from the fact that Noel and I shared that amazing night. Sometimes. The snow fell into the following day, and when we rose that morning, it was at least 5 inches thick. Noel warmed her hands on her mug of coffee and stood at the window, transfixed. A short distance along the road, we could see our neighbours, Sarah and Kevin, who held their infant daughter Olivia in a baby carrier strapped to his chest, out in the yard building a snowman. We'd been good friends with them ever since we moved in, and it made me smile to see their ruddy cheeks and the small puffs of steam they exhaled that rose around them as they laughed together. Noel waved down to Sarah. The diamond and pink sapphire engagement ring I'd agonised over for weeks, twinkling in the bright winter sunlight, and the happy family below saw her and waved back. I know this sounds cheesy, but it was an idyllic holiday morning. By midday, it became obvious that we weren't going to be driving anywhere for the foreseeable future, and my vain attempts to drive my battered old car out of the garage and across the snowbound driveway were very quickly dismissed as futile. Instead, I reversed the car back into its home, closing the garage door behind me. "It looks like we're stuck here," Noel had smiled. I really hadn't minded. I could think of nowhere else I'd rather be. There was just one blip on our otherwise wonderful day. Just after lunch, I accidentally brushed against the tree, knocking our star from the top. It hit the floor with a clatter, narrowly missing the assortment of brightly wrapped gifts that were already strewn about, and, much to Noel's dismay, snapped in two. It was the same star that Noel had placed atop her tree for over a decade, and while it looked a little threadbare, it bore some significant sentimental value for her. My attempts to mend the star came to naught, and I told a teary-eyed Noel that I promised I'd take her to buy a brand new one just as soon as the roads cleared. If only that had remained the worst thing we'd have to deal with. If only he hadn't come to our home. Later that evening, the fire was crackling away, casting a dancing light about the now darker room, when we heard the voice. It took a few moments to recognize that it was real, not from one of Noel's scratchy old Christmas records. It was a rich, deep voice, slowly and tunefully singing "I Saw Three Ships." Noel recognized it a moment before I did, a look of unadulterated joy spreading across her beautiful face as I asked her, "Can you hear that?" "A caroller," she cried, actually clapping her hands as we wandered out into the hallway. As we moved closer to the door, I could see a figure through the misted glass. Even from here, I could tell he was a big man, at least 6'5", broad-shouldered and barrel-chested. His voice was truly mesmerizing. His tone was perfect, not unlike the bassy baritone of a crooner such as Bing Crosby or Dean Martin. I could never have imagined that a voice such as that could come from someone like him. Someone capable of the things he did. I opened the door and stood, my hand on the doorframe, just taking in the sight before me. For a second, I thought we might have been visited by Santa himself. The caroller was indeed huge, dressed in a thick, warm red winter coat. The hood pulled up over his head, casting his face in shadow. The coat was padded, lined with insulation, so it added even more mass to the hulking figure before me. He even had a long, unruly beard that spilled down his burly chest. But unlike Santa, his was a fiery ginger rather than white. But on closer inspection, the similarity ended there. The caroller wore what looked like combat trousers and battered but sturdy-looking old black army surplus boots, which were partially buried in the thick snow. Illuminated by the glow of our porch light, snowflakes cascading down around him, hands behind his back, while his deep, powerful voice continued to boom out a classic carol. He truly was an awesome sight. I turned back to Noel to watch her reaction to the caroller. I knew her face would be a picture, and for a few brief seconds, it was. She grinned at him, mesmerized by his song. Then, abruptly, the rapt smile on her face shattered. Her eyes widened in unspeakable terror, and she started to scream. In that moment, I heard 3 distinct and separate sounds. Noel's heart-rending cries, a heavy, dull metallic thud, and the caroller's deep singing voice, utterly unfazed and smoothly continuing with his song. I was only dimly aware of a hot, aching sensation in my hand. As I turned back to see what had caused such a terrified reaction from my fiancée, it took me a few seconds to make sense of what I saw. The caroller was still singing, just his smiling mouth visible in the darkness of his hood. But he was attempting to tug something from the door frame, like a dentist trying to extract a tooth. Confused, I looked at what he'd gripped in his massive, paw-like hand. It was a meat cleaver, slick and gory, buried in the wood of the door frame. My blood ran cold as I looked down at the red snow by his feet. Scattered about his boots were some small, pink slugs. Why are they out in this weather? I thought to myself, as the caroller wrenched the cleaver free with his powerful arms. Then it dawned on me. They weren't slugs. They were my fingers. The caroller kept right on grinning and singing as he raised the cleaver for a second strike, and I froze, dumbly staring at the useless bloody stumps that marked where my fingers had once been on my right hand. Suddenly, Noel was there, slamming the door closed in the caroller's face, still screaming. "Chris!" she cried, over and over. She grabbed my scarf from beside the door, the same warm, woolly scarf I'd worn while decorating the front of our home with lights, and then took my wounded right hand in hers. Gently, she pulled me away from the door, even as she wrapped my scarf around my mutilated hand as a makeshift bandage. The dull ache was now a roaring pain, white hot and sending sparks of agony up my arm with every beat of my heart. "The police," I mumbled, my vision suddenly starting to swim. Maybe it was blood loss, maybe it was shock, but every step I took away from the door was shakier than the last. Noel pulled my arm over her shoulder, and together we staggered into the lounge, to the phone. Outside, the caroller continued to sing. As we reached the sofa, I tripped, stumbled, then eventually pitched forward onto the seat. Without thinking, I tried to break my fall, putting my hands out before me. Even wrapped in the scarf, the sudden jarring impact as the ruined stumps on my right hand struck the hard back of the chair was agony, causing me to cry out in pain. For a moment or two, I could only hear the rushing roar of my own blood in my ears. My vision little more than a white haze, as if I'd fallen face first into the deep snow outside. I don't know how close I came to passing out, but when I was next aware of my surroundings, Noel was cradling my head in her hands and telling me that I needed to stay with her. "Please, Chris," she whispered frantically. "Just stay awake. You need to stay awake." I nodded dully, knowing that somehow, fortuitously, I'd ridden out the pain. "Phone," I whispered again. "Police." Seemingly reassured that I wasn't going to pass out anytime soon, Noel nodded grimly, planted a kiss on my forehead, then scrambled across the room to the phone. She picked up the receiver, quickly punched the buttons, and then she started to weep. "It's dead," she sobbed, dropping the phone to the floor. "The line's dead." "The snow?" I asked. But even as I said it, I heard the voice from outside, echoing under the moonless sky. It was Silent Night. He was taunting us, telling Noel and I that he knew we weren't able to place the call. Then I saw that cleaver again in my mind's eye, its brutish weight and wicked sharp edge, and I knew he'd cut the cable. He'd silenced us. "Your cell," I hissed, and Noel nodded, before dashing out of the room and up the stairs to our bedroom. There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard her despairing cry. "Call failed." She ran back to me, dialing the emergency services over and over, each call ending in the same infuriating beep. I saw red, blood pounding in my ears. Before I knew what I was doing, I was already lunging towards the door. I don't know if I really thought I could hurt him, but I know that in that moment, I was ready to risk it all to try. I shouted a tirade of expletives, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and lurched across the room. Then, once again, Noel was there. She deftly stepped between me and the door, her big green eyes locked on mine. "No," she said, quietly but firmly. "Don't go out there. Please. I need you." And with that, she placed her left hand on my chest. The jewels in her engagement ring twinkling like lights on the tree just a few feet away. I felt the rage and fury ebb away, seeming to pour out of me as I realized she was right. If I ran out there and tried to fight him, what would happen if I lost? What would he do to her? It wasn't a risk I could bear to take. "Okay," I said, calmer, quieter. She didn't drop her hand straight away, frowning at me for a second longer. Unsure if I was truly ready to drop the foolhardy charge I'd been prepared to make moments earlier. "Seriously," I said, taking her hand in mine. "It's okay." With that, she nodded, then embraced me, holding me close as we both tried to comprehend the horror of what had just happened. It took me a moment to realize that once again, the night had fallen quiet. "Do you think he's gone?" I asked, gently releasing Noel and moving towards the curtains. "I don't know," she whispered back, already trying her phone again. The look on her face was enough to tell me that she still wasn't getting through. Coverage had always been an issue in our house, especially when we had atmospheric conditions such as rain or snow to contend with. We used to joke that the fact that no one from the office could ever reach her on a day off was the clincher in our decision to buy this place. We used to joke about a lot of things. I inched closer to the curtain, preparing to peek outside. I don't think I'd ever been more frightened than I was at the moment my hand closed around the material and prepared to pull it aside. I think we've all had that fear of peering out of a window into the dark and finding an unfamiliar face staring back. The difference was that this time I knew for a fact that the face would belong to a man who wanted us dead. We both held our breath as I stood there for what felt like 10 whole minutes, yet I realised was probably less than 20 seconds, paralysed with fear. Then I whipped the curtain back. There was nothing there, just our yard and the dark street beyond. I stood staring out into the night, trying to spot even the slightest hint of the caroller's presence. However, snow changes the familiar into something else. It coats and covers everything, obscuring some things, its bright colour lightening and transforming others. The weight of the drifts on the trees, hedges and bushes outside caused them to lean and sag under its weight. As the wind caused the branches to bob, each of them looked like a pale, watchful face, peeking out at me from behind a strange, shapeless white blob that could have been anything from a bike to a climbing frame to a rose bush. Time and time again, I thought, just for a split second, that I caught sight of the monster in the red coat, but I neither saw nor heard a thing. Finally, I exhaled. "He's not there," I said. "So what do we do?" Noel asked me. The sudden wave of relief I'd been feeling dissipated as I realised that the absence of our tormentor didn't mean anything. He was still out there, somewhere, and we had no idea if or when he might return. "We need to get somewhere safe, quickly," I replied. "The car?" Noel suggested. It was the only course open to us. That, or walk out into the dark night where he was waiting for us. I nodded, and then, as fast as we could, we dashed through the house to the kitchen. There was an adjoining door to the garage, so we'd be able to get to the car without needing to venture outside. I told Noel to wait at the door while I got in the car, started the engine, and then opened the sliding garage door to check that the path was clear. If that all went without a hitch, she was to run straight to the passenger side door, and then we would get the hell out of there and not stop until we hit the nearest town a few miles away. If anything else happened, she was to slam the door and lock it. At first, she protested, but I made her promise that she'd do as I asked. I couldn't let him have us both. It seemed like a good idea, one that could work. I really thought it could. With her reassurances that she wouldn't take any risks ringing in my ears, I kissed Noel goodbye and stepped into the garage. As I crept into the shadowy interior, I felt the temperature drop drastically. It must have been below freezing outside, yet still I could feel beads of sweat running down the small of my back, perspiration causing my shirt to cling to my armpits and sides. I was terrified, my head snapping back and forth into every corner, expecting the red-clad invader to suddenly bear down on me, cleaver raised, that terrible grin on his face. It never came, but that open space between me and the car left me feeling horribly exposed and vulnerable. I glanced back over my shoulder, once, twice, 3 times. But each time, the only face I saw was Noel staring back at me, tight-lipped and teary-eyed. Finally, I reached the vehicle, cursing when I saw that the windows were frosted over. That meant spending even more precious seconds with the engine running. Even longer that I'd be broadcasting our intentions to the caroller. As quickly as I could, I awkwardly threw the door open with my left hand, then dived inside, slamming the door closed behind me, a steel barrier between myself and the horrors outside. I breathed a long sigh of relief, then inserted the key in the ignition. I took a deep breath, turned it, and it purred to life. I don't think I'd ever been so grateful to hear a noise in my life. Quickly, I flicked the wipers on, hoping to clear my field of vision. I heard the rhythmic squeak as the rubber swept back and forth against the glass. But to my confusion, the window didn't clear. Frowning, I reached out to the screen and drew my fingers across it. They came away wet, leaving clear streaks that revealed the garage door before me. Condensation, not frost. I saw the gap beneath the garage door straight away, the deep mound of snow that had wedged it open. When I tried to close the shutter behind me earlier, at least 2 feet deep. Condensation on the inside of the screen. Then came the voice. Deep, melodic. Not from outside the car, but from the back seat behind me. Do you see what I see? I ripped the door open and threw myself out onto the dusty floor. As I did, I felt a searing hot pain in my shoulder, down my arm to the elbow. As I scrambled towards the door to the kitchen, Noel started to scream. Behind me, the door of my car creaked open, and the caroller unfolded himself from its dingy confines. "Chris, quickly!" Noel screamed, beckoning me with her hands. Hopping on the spot as she willed me towards the safety of our home. I don't remember regaining my feet or that short dash to the doorway. Instead, my next memory is of bracing the door with my shoulder, leaving an angry crimson smear on the paint from the fresh wound on my arm, while Noel stood beside me, locking it. No sooner had she turned the key than came an enormous thump of impact, one that rattled the door in its frame, so powerful that both Noel and I cried out in alarm. Then came another crash as the caroller threw his bulky frame against the door again, then again. Finally, he stopped, seeming to realize the futility of his efforts. He crooned gently behind the door. There was no sound of exertion in his voice, not the slightest hint that seconds earlier he'd been kicking and pounding on the door to kill us. He was like a machine, inhuman, relentless and without weakness. Noel and I stood frozen, staring towards the entrance to the garage. From beyond the door, we heard shuffling footsteps heading away from us, his voice fading as he walked back towards the garage door. We spent the next 5 minutes pushing bookshelves, tables, sofas, anything and everything bulky that we could lay our hands on, against all of the windows and doors on the ground floor. "Upstairs," I said when we finished. Noel nodded and followed me up the stairs. As I walked towards the bedroom door, I heard a sudden crash behind me and nearly jumped out of my skin. Whirling around, I saw the cabinet from our landing now on its side, blocking the top of the stairway, Noel pushing it into place. "Another barrier," she whispered. "It could buy us time." I hadn't even thought about what we'd do should the caroller gain access to our home, but Noel had, adding an extra level of security that could buy us valuable seconds should the worst come to the worst. "You're bleeding," she said, flatly, her voice dull, numbed by shock. I glanced down at the floor and saw a steady crimson pitter-patter of my blood raining down onto the old pine floor. Not only had the wounds from my hand started to leak through the scarf, but it was coming from my arm too. Now I had the time to inspect my injury. I realised how bad it was. The gash was deep, undoubtedly caused by a wild swing of that damned cleaver, and it would leave an ugly scar. This whole night would. "It'll be fine," I lied, knowing full well that I'd need medical attention sooner rather than later. "What do we do now?" Noel blinked, then raised her right hand. Even during the confusion and chaos of the events in the garage and our subsequent reinforcement of the house, she'd kept hold of her phone. We had a lifeline. She lifted it to her ear and again called for help. Again, the call failed. As she tried again and again, I moved over to our bedroom window and peered out into the darkness beyond the glow of our Christmas lights. In that moment, I was grateful for them. There are no streetlights on our little lane, and without the bulbs adorning the front of our home, there would have been no source of illumination, just the blackness of the night. Instead, they cast a glow that lit to just beyond the edge of our driveway. It wasn't much, but enough to see if our tormentor was again at our door. There was no sign of him, but, as if to remind me that we were still under his scrutiny, I heard a deep, clear voice ring out from the darkness, beyond the halo of light surrounding our home. It was good King Wenceslas. Another message, another warning that he was watching us and knew exactly what we were doing. I retreated from the window, terrified that at any moment his cleaver would come arcing out of the darkness, circling end over end until it crashed through the glass and into my exposed face. "I can't reach them," Noel said, tears of fury in her eyes. "This phone's useless. I can't reach anyone." "It's okay. Keep trying," I said, slipping my arm around her. Even as I said this, I knew things were far from okay, and that I needed to think of something, anything, to ensure that we made it through the night. Racking my brain, I sat heavily on the bed and watched as she walked over to the window, pulling back the edge of the curtain to peek out into the night. She stood there in silence, her back to me for a long time, and as she did, I realised that once again, the caroller's voice had fallen silent. "Do you see anything?" I asked, as I climbed to my feet and walked up behind her to join her vigil at the pane. "Nothing." I looked over her shoulder at the street below and saw something that made my heart freeze. Over the road, just a little down the way, I could see light from the windows of Kevin and Sarah's home. Our neighbours, with their baby daughter, were at this monster's mercy. I gasped in realisation, and as I did, Noel followed my gaze, then clamped a hand to her mouth. "Oh no," she cried, fresh tears springing to her eyes. I stared out into the darkness and realised that our friends and their child needed to be warned. I needed to go out into the night. "I need to get to them before he does," I whispered, my voice betraying my terror. "Chris, you can't," Noel cried, her hands gripping onto my shirt, her head shaking back and forth in denial. "I can't leave them to him," I said, gently loosening her fingers from my clothes. "They have a baby, Noel. Olivia is just a baby." "But what if you don't make it there?" Noel asked, anger in her voice now. He'll kill you, and you'll have died for nothing. Then he'll come here and kill me. Then he'll kill all of them, all of us, for nothing." "And what if I do make it there?" I replied gently. "Their phone might still be working. Maybe they have coverage in their home. And Kevin drives a 4x4. If anyone's car is getting out of here, it's his." Noel stared at me, furious and frightened, and it took every ounce of resolve I had to stick to my guns. More than anything, I wanted to just hide with her and hope that somehow, something else, somebody else, would make everything better. I wanted to stay, but I didn't. God damn me, I didn't. "Keep calling for help," I said. "Keep watch out of the window. If you see anything, you'll be able to warn me. With you watching my back, he won't be able to sneak up on me. I'll be safe." Noel glared at me, her lip trembling. Then, finally, she shook her head and dropped her gaze to the floor. "Okay," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I'll make it," I said, lifting her chin up. "I promise I will." "Okay," she said again, then wrapped her arms around me, holding me tight. We stood like that for a long time, neither saying anything. What else was there to be said? Eventually, we clambered over the cabinet at the top of the stairs and crept down them. We went into the kitchen, where we each grabbed the biggest carving knives we have, then made our way to the front door. Through the misted glass, I could see the snow falling again, heavily. Huge flakes the size of quarters. "That's good," I thought. "It'll hide me from him." I carefully slid the table away from the door, loosing the chain and unlocking it. "Lock this behind me," I said. Then I kissed my fiancée goodbye. As I flung the door open and darted out into the cold night air, I heard her voice behind me. "I love you." Then the door was closed, and I heard the locks clicking into place even as I dashed, crouching, towards the hedge. Feeling frighteningly exposed in the glare of the Christmas lights on the front of our home, I shuffled around the hedge on my hands and knees. The sound of my own breathing deafeningly loud in my ears. Frantically looking around me for any signs of the red-coated maniac who'd mutilated my hand. My feet sank into the snow, causing me to stumble, but I kept my head down and I plunged onward. I ran as if my life depended on it. My life did. It was just 100 feet or so to Kevin and Sarah's house, but the distance seemed to yawn before me. The snow fell heavier and heavier, a blizzard obscuring everything before me. As I sprinted into the dizzying, shifting, black and white emptiness before me, I misjudged the curb and fell, sprawling into the road. The knife I'd brought for protection skidding away into the night. If it hadn't been for the snow, I might have split my skull open right there. Yet even though the snow cushioned my fall, it was still hard enough. Packed down by the passage of vehicles during the day, my head slammed into it, my left cheek taking the brunt of the impact. I rolled over and over, dizzy, my left eye already closing as my face swelled. I didn't realize it then, but the blow had actually fractured my cheekbone. Instead, I lay there, my senses scrambled, my vision swimming. I tried to regain my equilibrium, rolling onto my front and slowly lifting myself up onto all fours. Then I heard him. "Oh, Christmas tree, oh, Christmas tree, how lovely are your branches." It was like being doused with a bucket of iced water. My head cleared instantly. The voice was loud, clear, close. I sprang to my feet and forged forward, desperately glancing around me, terrified that the cleaver-wielding monster would suddenly loom out of the darkness, that sick smile on his face as he sang. But instead, the figure remained motionless, impassive. A snowman. The same snowman I'd seen Kevin and Sarah building that very afternoon. It stared down at me, that silly, wide smile on its face. I almost wept with relief. I pitched forward, and then the door was there. I braced myself, lowered my shoulder, and with a deafening crash of splintering wood, the door burst inward, and I slid into the sanctuary of their bright hallway. Gasping, sweating, bleeding, I turned and slammed the door closed behind me, then stood for a moment, trying to catch my breath. With that, I heard the opening line to White Christmas. I span around towards the voice desperately, terrified, a surge of adrenaline flooding through me. My eyes swept around our neighbour's homely house, towards the stairs, the kitchen, the living room, expecting to see the caroller at any moment. But he wasn't there, nor was anyone else. The house was still. And then I realised that wasn't his voice. It was the original recording. Bing Crosby's voice coming from a speaker somewhere within the house. I actually laughed. A sudden, unexpected noise that seemed to bubble up from my chest and out of my mouth without warning. Finally, the laughter, or was it sobbing, subsided, and I coughed to clear my throat. Then I realised that other than the voice of good old Bing, I hadn't heard a single other noise. Not even a mouse. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be so callous. This is hard. I can't forget that night. I can still see what I saw in there. What he did to those people. I found Kevin on the rug in front of their fire. His face looked terrified. Empty, bloody, eyeless sockets. Gazing towards the family's lopsided tree. Broken baubles on the floor around his mutilated torso. Later, I learned they weren't logs crackling away on the fire. They were his legs. Horrified, I ran through to the kitchen, praying that I wasn't too late for Sarah and Olivia, even though I already knew the truth. I found Sarah there. Her limbs had been bound with tinsel. Then, when he'd finished with her, in a spidery, childish scrawl, the caroller had daubed a message on the wall in her blood. It read, "I saw Mummy kissing Santa Claus." In tears, I stumbled back to the lounge, heading straight for the phone, weeping as I went. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. Nothing. "God damn you!" I screamed, hurling the phone across the room and at the 6-foot fir tree in the corner. It was only then that I remembered the song that I'd heard out in the snow. Another message. Sweating, holding my breath, I took a hesitant step towards the tree, then another. And then I saw why it leant in such an ungainly way. That wasn't an angel at the top. It almost looked like a doll. She almost looked like a doll. I threw up, a spray of vomit erupting between my fingers and splattering down onto the blood-stained rug where my friend and neighbour had spent his last agonised moments of life. That monster had killed them all, butchered them. They died in their home, terrified, and I'd been too late, too stupid, too scared to do anything about it. I sank to the floor, head in my hands, and cried. What else could I do? I'd failed them, and I'd failed Noel. In my mind's eye, I saw what the caroller had done to Sarah. Noel was alone, and he was out there. I set off at a sprint, throwing the door wide open and plunging out into the billowing snow. I was reckless, not even thinking about the risks to my own safety. I just needed to get back to her now. I was so consumed with that thought that I didn't see the figure until it was right in front of me. I skidded to a halt, bellowing in alarm, as the shape loomed out of the snow and shadow. It was that damn Snowman again. I swore loudly, suddenly consumed with fury, and lifted my foot to kick it over in frustration. Then I saw the raspberry pink streaks on the Snowman's face, clown-like tears of paint. No, not paint. Tracing down to the corners of its stupid grin. Stepping closer, I finally looked at its eyes. Kevin's eyes. I took off, sliding on the same patch of ice that I'd fallen afoul of twice before. Tumbling forward, but breaking my fall with my good hand and quickly regaining my feet. As I dashed back towards the house, legs pumping and heart pounding, I saw something glinting in the road, a flash of silver in the moonlight. My knife. I remember thinking that this was finally a stroke of good fortune, on a night that had brought us all nothing but ill. I scooped to snatch it from the snow, then straightened back up and continued towards my house, my fiancé, my life. I'd taken barely 2 more steps when he slammed into me, the knife again flying from my grip, my unprepared body hitting the hard-packed snow with a thud. I felt his weight on top of me as I lay face down on the floor, and quickly, instinctively, I swung an elbow back hard, trying to catch my attacker unawares before the cleaver could fall. It didn't work. Instead, a strong grip fastened around my arm and yanked my arm back hard, causing me to cry out in pain. I struggled, shouting furiously, but then I felt something cold and hard snap around my wrist. "I said freeze!" shouted the man on my back as he wrenched my wounded hand behind my back and fastened the other cuff around my wrist. As he lifted me to my feet, I became aware of the flashing blue light. A police car. A policeman. He was young, powerfully built, with short, closely cropped hair, and the sort of face that suggested there was no room for argument when it came to his demands. "Oh, thank God," I sighed, sagging with relief. "I just need your name, sir," the officer said, glancing about, just in case the blood-soaked maniac he just apprehended had any accomplices. I blurted out my name and told him that I'd lived just over the road, that we'd been trying to reach the police all night, and that there was a lunatic on the loose and... "Who's we?" he interjected, loosening his grip on my collar. Something I'd said had managed to convince him I was no threat, and he seemed to visibly relax around me, even if he wasn't going to take any risks. "My fiancée Noel," I replied, as my head whipped back and forth, looking for our home through the heavy snow. "Okay, sir. We received an emergency call from her. Can you tell me which house is yours?" Upon hearing those words, my heart soared. At long last, someone up there in the heavens had smiled down on us and given us the good fortune for which we'd been so desperate for all night. Noel had finally managed to get through to the authorities. We were safe at last. "Yes," I replied, turning towards our home. "Come on, I'm going there now. It's the one with all the lights." At first, I couldn't see the lights on our house, and I couldn't understand why. Finally, I spotted them, but something was wrong. There weren't as many. They seemed to be more sparsely distributed than I remembered, and several of them seemed to be piled up in a mound at the bottom of the wall, unceremoniously dumped there. It was as if they'd been ripped from the wall, or had fallen away under the weight of something bulky, collapsing as something heavy and powerful had climbed them. I don't remember much about what happened next. It seems I broke free from the officer and ran towards the house. I can see flashes, snatches of memory. The door already open. Bloody footprints on the stairs. The cabinet pushed aside on the landing. The dark puddle seeping out from underneath the bedroom door. Noel. The pieces of Noel. Then the policeman was on me, bundling me out of the door, screaming into his radio for assistance, even as he dragged me back down the stairs, out of the door, to his car. I've no idea how long it took for the others to arrive. It could have been hours. It could have been seconds. I remember crying, unable to answer the paramedic's questions as he examined my battered, swollen face, my mutilated hand, the terrible gash in my arm. Later that night, they told me that Noel was gone. Of course, I knew that. I'd seen what he'd done to her. Seen the blood spattered up the walls, dripping from the ceiling. When I close my eyes now, I still see it. Every single time. So much blood. A week later, I was released. Still sore and taking a cocktail of pain medication to get to sleep. Despite the bitterly cold afternoon air, so freezing it caused my bones to ache. I spent at least 5 minutes standing on the doorstep, unable to move into the house that had once been my home, but would now only ever be the place I lost Noel. I don't know exactly how long I'd been stood there when I was interrupted by a tall man with a weary face, wearing a long coat, who walked up the path behind me and introduced himself as Detective Ryder. Ashamed of the fear that had kept me outside, I let us both into the house and we went through to the lounge. There, Ryder told me that over the remaining few hours before dawn, the police had conducted a thorough sweep of the street. As well as Kevin, Sarah and Olivia, they found the bodies of the Bridges family in the next house along. Mr. Bridges had been a gruff, surly guy, yet his wife and teenage son seemed to always be so happy, as if they'd somehow siphoned off his share of festive goodwill. I don't know what the caroller did to them. I suppose I should be thankful for that. Further down the road, Mrs. Parsons had been out visiting family that evening and was unable to get back home in the snow. That trip had saved her life. The cleaver was from her kitchen. They never found the caroller. Ryder told me that the crimes weren't unlike some that occurred over the holiday period last year, right across the country. The police were treating both cases as related. The murders last year, like those of the night I lost Noel, remained unsolved. This should be the part where my story ends, but it hasn't yet. I know it hasn't. Just 3 days ago, after the cleaners had finished with the house, I finally mustered up the energy to clear away our Christmas decorations. I didn't want any more reminders of that night. I was done with Christmas, for good. As I took down the tree, I saw a tag on one of the gifts on the floor below. Noel's curling handwriting. To my husband-to-be, with all my love, N. The tears came suddenly, without warning, and my body was racked with sobs so powerful that they brought me to my knees. I crouched there, beneath the tree, and wailed and howled, as if the only release from my grief would be to scream it out of me. If only it were that simple. Finally, the pain subsided, and I wiped the tears and snot from my face with the gauze on my still bandaged hand. I was alone. I will always be alone. Kneeling there, I started to rummage through the presents, sorting them into piles, mine and Noel's, stopping occasionally to weep once more, as I thought about how Noel would have reacted to each of the gifts I bought her, or to sob as I read more of her thoughtful handwritten tags. I thought I'd finished when I spotted one last parcel way down at the back of the tree. It was small, shoddily wrapped, and seemed out of place there. The pattern on the paper was unfamiliar and seemed a little strange. Odd spots dotted about it in a haphazard manner. Confused, I reached back and pulled it out. There was no tag on it, so I held it up to take a better look. That was when I realised that the spots on the paper weren't some avant-garde pattern. It was blood, seeping through from within. I don't know why I didn't just throw it across the room and get straight on the phone to Detective Ryder. I don't know why I had to open it, had to see what he'd left for me. But I did. I had to look. With a shaking hand, I peeled back the paper to reveal a dirty cardboard box, one that was taken from our own trash. On top of it was a note, written in that same childlike scrawl that I'd seen on the wall in Kevin and Sarah's kitchen. I read it, then slowly unfolded the lid of the box. I saw grey skin, dark red flesh, white knobs of bone. He'd made a star for the top of the tree, one he'd fashioned from fingers, bound together with his own thick red hair. At first, I thought he'd just scooped up mine from the snow, but I soon realised that there were too many. It was only when I recognised the diamond and pink sapphire engagement ring on one that I realised he'd used some of Noel's too. Detective Ryder arrived quickly. His team took the star and the note, searching it for further clues, running it for DNA and fingerprints, seeking some clue as to the identity of the caroller. They didn't see what I saw, didn't understand his message to me. Today, I bought a gun, and tonight I will sit by my door and wait for him to return. And if he doesn't, I'll do it again tomorrow night and the next night. I'll wait every night until Boxing Day, because I know that between now and then, he's coming back to finish what he started, to finish me. I'll sit, the gun in my hand, waiting to hear that voice one more time. And then either I'll kill him or he'll kill me. I'll let you know if I survive. But if you don't hear from me, beware. Should you hear a deep voice singing out loud and clear one cold Christmas evening, lock your doors, switch off your lights, phone for help and pray. It might be enough to save you. It might be. I suppose you want to know how I came to realise that he'll be coming back. What the note said that Ryder and his team have yet to decipher. It was more lyrics, another message through song. The line was from a track I'd heard hundreds of times during my relationship with Noel. One that I'd even joked would be the first dance at our wedding. It was a line from I'll Be Home for Christmas. The note simply read, "You can count on me."